There's no doubting what you've achieved on a technical level. This game clearly is state of the art. There are just certain design choices that you made for this game that I don't fully understand. I was hoping you could shed some light on those. There's lore, and there are robots. There are several mini-games throughout the game that you can play right at your fingertips. We even have voice acting. With all due respect, those are not the design choices we were referring to, Mr. Cawthon. I think FNAF Sister Location is a bad Five Nights at Freddy's game. Now, before you try to burn me at the stakes like it's 1693, I really want you to pay close attention to my wording there. It's not a bad game, just a bad FNAF game. And I felt this way ever since I first played it when it came out about 10 years ago at the time of writing this. From the get-go, something just felt off about this game to me, but me being a young kid at the time just really couldn't put into words what I was actually feeling about it. Before diving into why I feel the way I do about this game, I feel like it's worth addressing the elephant in the room. You cannot talk about this game negatively without reminding people of the classic "oh yeah" hit piece on Sister Location. And I rewatched that video before beginning to script this one, mainly because I figured I'd agree with a lot of the points he made regarding the game. So imagine my surprise when I fundamentally disagreed with like 70% of what he had to say. When it came to any issues with actual gameplay he mentioned, I actually tended to agree, but when it comes to a FNAF game, smooth and robust gameplay isn't exactly what I was ever looking for anyway.
We're gonna go down to parts and services, and I'm gonna shove a beak inside of you, and you are going to be able to talk better. Did you hate the idea that much?
What I've always been looking for is the story, and by extension, the characters within said story. And in that regard, this game just failed to meet anything that I'd come to expect from this series in a plethora of ways, and not in a good way. I've managed to narrow down the way I feel about this game into 3 main points. One being the plot itself, and mainly its effects on the greater narrative of the FNAF universe. 2 being the artistic decisions of the game. And last but certainly not least, what it did to the purple guy. So all that being said, we're just going to kind of take it point by point and just jump right into it. But before I pick this game apart, I feel it's only right that I at least give a wee bit of a brief synopsis of the story, and while doing so, I do actually have a few positive things I'd like to say about it, because again, as a standalone story, I actually do quite enjoy this game. Our story begins in the huge industrial elevator of the location, with us being quickly introduced to Han Unit. He functions sort of like our phone guy for this game. I know that quite a few people have a lot of problems with Han Unit as a concept, but weirdly enough, I never actually minded his inclusion. I think he's a good foil for the usual isolation of these games, and him being absent in the more intense horror-oriented sections serves to enhance those moments. And the one time he does speak during those sections, that being Ballor's ballroom area, it actually does increase the intensity by quite a bit. All that being said, however, the mere existence of Han Unit and how advanced the technology would have to be at the time period that this game is meant to be taking place just took me right out from the get-go. But I'll get more into that later. We move into the main security room, if you could even really call it that. And from there we are introduced to what I like to call false mechanics. The game sets up the lights and controlled shocks as if they're going to be some form of defense against the animatronics, which serves to make it far more effective when those forms of safety are ripped from you as the game proceeds. I love this. I think it's a very good way to just make it so you never truly feel safe in Sister Location. And honestly, no notes. I think it's class. Throughout the nights, we are introduced to each of the characters who reside in this bunker and have to navigate each of them in unique ways. But none of them stand out more than Circus Baby herself, the sister within this location. Now this is where the game stops working for me, in all honesty. This may be a very niche and unpopular opinion, but as soon as this robot started speaking directly to the player, it immediately made the animatronics a lot less scary and mysterious to me. If you were around for the release of the first 4 FNAF games, I think that you'll probably understand what I mean whenever I say those first 4 games were scary partly because you couldn't really tell what the animatronics were thinking. FNAF up to this point had really played under the fear of the unknown, and aside from FNAF World, absolute peak game by the way, the animatronics themselves had this unknown factor to them. They always seemed more like wild animals than actual intelligent creatures, to me at least. And that's why they were scary. They were like apex predators, and not the Roblox game developer type of apex predator. And don't get me wrong, I understand that this is a story game, and for Scott to make this story work, Baby had to be able to communicate with the player. But my point is, this story is fundamentally flawed and completely sacrifices what made these games so scary to begin with to tell a story that just doesn't fit into the wider lore the previous entries had already laid the groundwork for. And it breaks my heart to say that, honestly, because voice implementation in these games is something that I was legitimately so excited for going into the release of this game. Baby isn't the only one who speaks directly to the player like this either. Ballora does it as well when you're sneaking through your room. But with Ballora, it makes even less sense because as far as we knew at that point, she wasn't possessed, so we're just meant to believe that she's some super advanced AI model who can speak to people. Same as Hand Unit, who is also super advanced despite this game supposedly taking place before we even get into the 2000s. But after all was said and done, the one form of animatronic voice acting that I actually ended up enjoying in this game was Funtime Freddy, due to the fact that he speaks as if he's running through preset lines of dialogue. In fact, just while I'm on the topic, I do actually really enjoy the entire Funtime Freddy Breaker Room section, because it has a bit of a callback to FNAF 2, where the phone guy says that animatronics follow noise to find where the people are. Whether that's intentional or not, who's to say? I just enjoyed it personally. But on top of all of that, the fact that Funtime Foxy never speaks is actually also really effective. In a game with an abundance of dialogue, Foxy really stands out. It just makes them feel like much more of a threat. I do just want to cap off this little bit here and say that none of this is a critique against any of the voice actors themselves. All of them, particularly Heather Masters as Baby, do a fantastic job. I'm mainly criticising how the voices were utilised more than anything. But anyways, to get back on track, we find ourselves running through this location every night, completing different maintenance jobs and occasionally talking to Baby when prompted. I honestly don't have many bad things to say about the gameplay overall here. I think the argument that the game is only really effective on a first playthrough is a valid criticism, but it's not something that ever bothered me, especially when I think that that was the intention of this game. The only negative in gameplay I'll get into is Night 4, with the Springlock suit. My main issue with this section is it just simply isn't fun. Even with the difficulty being toned down later, this whole night is just press 2 keys to wiggle and click your mouse on circles. And I could forgive this if it was a short minigame and a longer, more varied night, but it isn't. Recently I was watching Flats play through the game for the first time, and he literally took over an hour to get through this section alone. And if you're going to tell me that the guy who plays hero shooters at a high level for a living is struggling with this, then it's clear to me that there's something terribly, terribly wrong. Just while I'm talking about the gameplay, I just want to mention that I don't really plan to touch on the custom night that was added later at all either. Mainly because I have very few issues with it, and any that I do have already been talked about to death already. I think it's good that it added replayability people thought was lacking, and I think that the cutscene where Mike's disemboweled corpse just stands up is just a bit stupid, but that's really it. But the game comes to a head in Night 5, where you start your night as usual. But things begin to get a bit more sinister, however, when you do your usual checks and find the technicians hanging from the ceiling. Completely unscripted tangent here, by the way. If Baby's whole plan was to go and take over Mike's body from the very start, why did they just kill the technicians instead of just trying to take over one of their bodies? From here, you for some reason just decide to keep doing your job until eventually Baby does the most devious heel turn of all time, and then uses a big ice cream scoop to make your insides your outsides. And then apparently they just crawl in? Now, I'm really simplifying the plot here, but that's mainly because I'm sure if you're watching this video, you're already at least familiar with the game. Baby and the gang's entire motive here is to take over Michael Afton's body in order to escape the facility and be free. Which sounds perfectly fine and reasonable, until you start to think of it in line with how the rest of these games have played out thus far. In FNAF 1, the animatronics are mindless murder robots. In FNAF 2, the animatronics are criminal-finding mindless murder robots. In FNAF 3, the animatronic is a murderer who is mindless and a robot. And in FNAF 4, the animatronics aren't real. At least as far as we knew at the time, because the newer lore may throw a wrench into that, which is exactly my point. This is where that so-called newer lore starts. Suddenly the game starts retconning things that we had already previously established in older titles. These robots start becoming too human and less spiritual. They go from animalistic to walking, talking people in robot armor, and forgive me when I say that that defeats the whole purpose of them being animatronics to begin with. And you know what? I could forgive that. I could forgive the fact that Baby acts just like her previous human self if it just made sense in the context of the game. But Baby is a child. She is Elizabeth Afton. How on earth is she able to come up with a super intricate master plan to steal someone else's body and escape the facility? How did they know the scooper would work on a human? And are we meant to just believe that the scooper was able to perfectly rip an entire skeleton out of Mike's body without just ripping him clean in half? I can only suspend my disbelief so much at this point, and I know that people are thinking, this is FNAF, we've always had to suspend our disbelief, but to that I say, we never had to do leaps in logic like this in the first 4 games. Springlock suits were the closest we ever came, and even then, you can clearly see that William was in fact ripped apart in that suit. That makes sense. The first 4 games always teetered this line between grounded and fantasy that just made the games feel real. They placed you in there with the horror. This game and its plot not only crosses that line, but it gets rid of the line entirely. It kills all of the horror just so the plot can continue, which would be fine if it weren't a horror game, but it is, and that's why we played them. Which segues me right into the next section of this video. The design choices. And let me preface this with saying, this game is honestly gorgeous. I've always loved the retro-futuristic look of Scott Cawthon's earlier work, particularly The Desolate Hope, and this game does well to replicate that art style in various ways. I do not, however, believe that the art style of this game fits the universe, nor the era that it takes place in. Theorists for this series have spent countless hours attempting to place where Sister Location falls into the timeline. But it is my opinion that no matter where you place it, Sister Location's futuristic sci-fi art style makes absolutely zero sense. I'll try to keep this brief, as a lot of points that I have to make here would be better kept until I talk about William Afton later on. First of all, let me compliment the animatronic designs. They're honestly some of Scott's best work throughout the series, and on their own, they're a genuine marvel to look at. And that also goes for the building itself. The purples and blues, along with the constant presence of chrome metal plating along the walls. Perfect. And speaking of metal plating, I do have to admit that the animatronic metal faceplates were genuinely a really sick design choice, regardless of how little they fit into the universe. But these designs just don't work. They are outliers. They do not fit. Right down to the very endoskeleton, which is just a jumbled mess of wires. In the lore of this game, we are told this location is officially called Circus Babies Rentals, and the purpose of these animatronics is for them to be rented out for children's parties similar to clowns or bouncy castles. Little side tangent, an animatronic rental service is genuinely a really cool concept that I feel could have been tapped in a little more. FNAF AR kinda took the concept, but that was a mobile game filled with microtransactions, so it was always kinda just doomed from the start. But anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah, the art style of this game is just such a jarring shift of what we'd already gotten used to, and there's just no lore explanation given as to why the robots are suddenly so advanced. We're just kind of meant to accept it at face value. And the funny part is, we can tell exactly why this is. Scott Cawthon just can't stop making sci-fi. The man is utterly obsessed with it. Many of his older games are evidence of that. And power to him, I love sci-fi myself. Hell, Star Wars is one of my favourite fictional stories, if not my favourite fictional story ever. But it just doesn't work here. We're again running into a similar point as to what I made earlier. When you over-exaggerate too much with this series, it kills the horror. When you suddenly have to suspend your disbelief 10 times as much as you've had to do in the past, it kills the horror. When the robots can suddenly open their face and look like they were spat out of the year 3012, it kills the horror. Scott took a simple premise of animatronic robots and ran it into the ground. And aside from his love of sci-fi, I think I know why he went this direction. Scott likely felt that the positive reception for FNAF 4 meant that people wanted more variance, more divergence from the status quo. But I believe that he failed to realise why FNAF 4 worked as well as it did. It wasn't real. It was a nightmare. An over-exaggerated nightmare from the mind of a dying child. At least, as long as that was the intention from the get-go, because if it was always some sort of super advanced sound disc that made you hallucinate, then I'll be honest, that kind of sucks too, for a lot of the same reasons. But honestly, this can all boil down to the game being far too futuristic in a series where half the appeal was it taking place in the 80s and 90s golden era of animatronic pizza places. Hell, even FNAF 3 made it work, and that took place, when? 2023? Now don't get me wrong, this has been a whole load of yap, but I'm not done. I have one more person that I'd like to talk about. William Afton. And good lord, do I have a lot to say about this guy. Before getting into this, let me just say, up to this game's release, William / the Purple Guy was easily my favourite character in this series. I love a good villain, and the game's done a fantastic job of building him up as this small town killer who finally got what was coming to him because he was sloppy. FNAF 1 introducing us to the idea of there being a killer and spoke briefly about it in a few news articles with some Easter eggs about the heinous crimes they had committed. FNAF 2 then elaborating on them, giving us cryptic details about the things that he'd done and the people he'd hurt, even showing us that the 5 original missing kids weren't his only victims. Then FNAF 3 bringing that satisfying conclusion to the villain, but left it open-ended, with him becoming the very thing that he'd turned the children into, nothing more than a mangled corpse, now more machine than man. And FNAF 4 just keeping him as this small blink and you'll miss it Easter egg, showing him in his early days, possibly before he even began the killing spree, and perhaps giving us a bit of clarity on why he became the man he did, as it's heavily implied that the child that you play as in FNAF 4 is his son. But Sister Location ruined the Purple Guy for me, and I can pinpoint the exact moment that William went from being an interesting and captivating villain to me, to a complete joke. And here it is.
She can dance.
That's right. That's the moment. The very second he spoke. For 2 reasons. Firstly, as per usual, the entire mystique is gone. He stops being a horror story and just becomes a guy. And secondly, to make it worse, he's a British guy. These games are set in, excuse my language, fucking Utah. He sounds like every stereotypical villain ever. And William isn't just meant to be every villain ever. He's meant to be a serial killer. That's what the games portrayed him as. Just an evil piece of shit, murdering people because that's what he wanted to do. And that was enough. To make it worse, as we get more context, we discover William not only built the Sister Location and the animatronics, but that he built them specifically to kill children. So let's put this into perspective. He's a British man who can build robots decades ahead of their time in robotics, with advanced AI that can hold conversations with any person, and to top it all off, it's revealed that he's trying to find the secret to eternal life. And I know people like this version of William Afton. I know people enjoy what he became. But if you were like me, when we found all of this out, you probably had a similar reaction of, oh, he actually kind of sucks now, I liked him better before. William became a Batman villain. And that'd be great if this were a Batman comic. But it isn't. It's my opinion that as soon as Scott gave William an actual goal, especially one as out there and utterly preposterous as immortality, all the magic was just gone. But the biggest crime here isn't even just what the game did for him. It's how it set the precedent for how he'd be portrayed going forward. Suddenly now, because he has a voice actor, William starts talking in FNAF 6. An awful design aside, he starts cracking jokes and trying to sound edgy and threatening, and while it's not canon to FNAF, he also acts like that in the Dead by Daylight crossover, and I hate it. I hate how bastardized he's become from the early days, how much less threatening he is, how people take him less seriously as a villain because his story is now so overblown and bloated that it just has no meaning anymore. Sometimes characters can just be evil. Sometimes the best villain to your story about murder is someone who just wants to kill. And I suspect that that was the original intent behind the character. Why? Because that's exactly how he was portrayed in the FNAF movie. And that's literally the best part of that film. He's hardly in it, and when he is, he acts like an evil bastard who owns that shit. Matthew Lillard as William is exactly what I expected William to be like when I was younger. And he's all the more scary for it. I don't even mind Circus Baby being included in the second film either, because in the lore of those films, we haven't had any evidence that she's a murder machine that he's using to kill children. In fact, we don't even really see him murder any of the kids. We either see him driving off, or the aftermath. I could literally talk for days about just how much I hate William in the game lore, and not even in the way that Scott intended me to. I just don't think he's threatening anymore. There's no more mystery. He's just Dr. Doofenshmirtz with a British accent and a lust for blood, and I just think that's a really, really boring concept compared to the dark story that the games have built up to that point. The reason I decided to make this video is because I love the first 4 FNAF games dearly. Hell, by extension I love FNAF World 2. And when I play through them, I like to think of them in the context of when I played them when I was a kid. It was a much simpler story with a much simpler villain. And I don't even want to get into the idea of Remnant, because I think I could make a whole video on that in itself. Sister Location started a snowball effect, where questions started getting very overcomplicated answers. It's fine to have a mystery get solved, but some mysteries are best unsolved. Sometimes that's better for the narrative, and sometimes that's just a more satisfying conclusion. When you try to explain every little detail, it not only takes away from the mystery and the fun of the audience drawing their own conclusion, but it also means that when you don't explain other things later, people just get frustrated and your story gets muddled. I mentioned Star Wars earlier, and that's a prime example on 2 counts. Firstly, we never needed to know who Rey's parents were. If we didn't, it'd be infinitely more satisfying than the conclusion that we actually got. And secondly, we never needed to know how the Force worked. Midichlorians just take away from the mystique. Does any of this make any sense? Hell if I know. This video's script already worked out a lot longer than I expected. I guess I just didn't realise how passionate I was about it until I started writing. But I hope that people can really grasp that this does come from a place of love, because I do love these games, and I do love Sister Location in my own way. The memories that I have tied to this game specifically and its release, I wouldn't trade for anything. But I can't pretend that it didn't fundamentally change how I view this series, and not in a positive way. This video is already going to be hard enough to edit as is, so I'm just going to cut myself off here. I'd like to thank you all for watching my little stupid rant. I'd like to thank you all for sitting through my little stupid rant. And I'd also like to thank, oh yeah, for really sparking this in my mind again when I was rewatching his video, regardless if I disagree with a lot of what he had to say about it. He really got the gears turning. But that's about it. I hope to catch you around again, lads.